The news came quietly. No headlines screaming, no flashbulbs blazing, just a whisper across the wires that left Hollywood breathless. Diane Keaton, the woman whose laughter had once filled the screen with sunlight, was gone. 79 years. Her brilliance, wit, and defiance had come to an end on a still October morning in Los Angeles. It was as though the city itself went silent for a heartbeat. From directors to co-stars, the tributes began to pour in, but none carried the weight or the heartbreak of the two men whose lives had been forever shaped by her: Woody Allen and Al Pacino. Allen, now in his late 80s, wrote a public letter that felt more like a love poem than an obituary. Her face and laugh illuminated any space she entered, he said. I made movies for an audience of one, Diane Keaton. Pacino, whose voice once rumbled through the Godfather's empire, reportedly sat in quiet disbelief, telling a friend that he would never stop loving her. Two men, two stories, and one woman whose absence suddenly felt like the closing curtain on an entire era of American cinema. She had been the last link to a time when actors were poets and film sets were battlegrounds of emotion. Keaton's death wasn't just the loss of an icon. It was the end of a generation that believed movies could change the soul. To the public, Diane was a legend. To Woody and Al, she was a chapter of their lives written in laughter, silence, and the kind of affection that never really ended. Allen's essay, published in the Free Press, described her as unlike anyone the planet has experienced or is unlikely to ever see again. Pacino's circle told reporters he had been devastated. One friend claimed, he whispered, "She was my heart. I just didn't know it in time." For both men, her death reopened a door they had closed decades ago, the door to what might have been. In the days that followed, film reels began to resurface online, scenes of Diane in her prime. That wide-brimmed hat, that offbeat timing, that spark that made her both untouchable and utterly human. Audiences watched in disbelief that the woman who once seemed eternal had truly gone. Hollywood reporters revisited her legacy, but what most people remembered wasn't the Oscar or the films. It was her authenticity, the way she never seemed to belong to fame, yet somehow embodied it. She made imperfection fashionable. She made independence beautiful. When asked once why she never married, she replied with her signature grin, "I don't think it would have been a good idea for me to have married, and I'm sure they're happy about it too." It was the kind of honesty that only Diane Keaton could deliver, disarming, funny, and piercingly true. Her passing struck Woody Allen and Al Pacino in entirely different ways, yet both reactions carried the same echo of loss. For Allen, it was the death of a muse, the woman whose eccentric grace had shaped his most beloved films. For Pacino, it was the loss of the woman who had once dared to love him, when his own heart was still learning how. Allen's tribute was filled with gratitude, Pacino's silence with regret, and together they painted the perfect portrait of Diane Keaton, the woman who inspired devotion but never asked for it. The fans gathered outside the TCL Chinese Theater, where her handprints remain etched in stone. Some carried lilies, others old DVDs. One young woman held a handwritten sign that read, "She taught me how to be weird and proud of it." It was the kind of love Diane never asked for, yet always earned. As the tributes continued, veteran filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola added his own words. Everything about Diane was creativity personified. The words felt less like a statement and more like an elegy, because everyone who had known her, or thought they knew her, understood that she wasn't just acting. She was translating herself onto film, piece by piece. For Woody Allen, her death also marked the end of a dialogue that had lasted half a century. He once said he never read reviews because he only cared what Diane thought. In a way, his movies had always been letters to her, scripts disguised as conversations he wished he could continue. And now, that conversation was over. He wrote, "The world is drearier without her. But her laugh still echoes in my head, a single line that felt like both heartbreak and closure. If this story has touched your heart, take a moment to honor her. Hit like as a tribute to Diane Keaton's legacy." For Al Pacino, the grief was quieter but heavier. He'd spent years avoiding nostalgia, yet now the past came flooding back, Images of a younger Diane walking across the Godfather set, her eyes full of questions and sunlight. Friends said he sat alone in his Beverly Hills home, re-watching their old scenes together, sometimes pausing the frame as if to hold her still for one more second. There are loves that fade when people part, and then there are loves that freeze in time, forever caught in the light of what almost was. Pacino reportedly told a friend, "I thought there would always be time. There never is." It was a confession, stripped of performance, a man realizing that fame can buy everything except one more chance. As Hollywood mourned, something extraordinary happened. Instead of gossip and speculation, there was reverence. Her death united an industry often divided by ego. It reminded everyone that behind the awards and scandals, there once was a generation of artists who simply loved the craft, and no one embodied that love more than Diane Keaton. She had lived as she performed, unafraid, unapologetic, and unforgettable. Even in her final absence, she managed to pull the spotlight not toward her fame, but toward her spirit. The laughter that had once filled every room she entered was gone now, but in the quiet you could almost still hear it. Here, not as an echo of loss, but as a reminder that joy once shared never truly dies. And so the story begins, not with her birth, but with the echo of her absence. Because to understand why the world grieves, we must first remember how her light began. Before the applause, before the Oscar, before the fame that would one day make her immortal, there was simply Diane Hall, a little girl in Los Angeles who dreamed too much and fit in too little. She was born on January 5, 1946, in a modest home in Highland Park. Her father was a civil engineer, quiet and thoughtful. Her mother, a beauty queen who once reigned over local pageants, was a storyteller who filled the family living room with laughter and ideas. Diane grew up watching her mother's imagination take flight. That's where she learned her first truth. Stories could make people feel less alone. She was restless as a child, curious, rebellious, and unsure of her place in the world. While other girls practiced charm, she practiced observation. She loved people, but always from a distance, as if life was a stage and she was still learning her lines. Teachers described her as imaginative but distracted. She was never the loudest in the room, but always the most memorable. Her notebooks were filled with doodles and odd little monologues about love and death. Even then, she was trying to figure out how to make ordinary moments extraordinary. As she entered her teenage years, the 1950s optimism around her began to clash with her growing sense of contradiction. She adored beauty yet distrusted vanity. She wanted love but feared belonging. Years later, she would say that this confusion, this collision of freedom and fear, became the foundation of every character she ever played. At home, Diane watched her parents' marriage with quiet fascination. Her father's practicality balanced her mother's creative spark, but the relationship also revealed the compromises love demanded. She once overheard her mother telling a friend, "I gave up the stage to have a family." That sentence lingered in her mind like a warning. She didn't want to give anything up. Not art, not freedom, not herself. By high school, Diane had already decided that she didn't want to be a wife or a secretary or a silent face in the background of someone else's dream. She wanted to live a story worth telling, even if she had to write it herself. At Pasadena City College, she began performing in small plays. It was there that Diane discovered the strange comfort of pretending to be someone else. Acting, for her, wasn't about escaping reality. It was about confronting it. Each character became a mirror. Every performance was a question she couldn't yet answer. Her professors saw something special. Not the typical polish or perfection, but something raw, a vulnerability that made even silence interesting. When she stood on stage, she didn't act like a star. She acted like a person who was still figuring life out. That honesty would one day make her unforgettable. After graduation, she took a leap of faith. With little money and big ambition, she moved to New York City. She changed her name to Keaton, her mother's maiden name, and set out to find her place in a world already overflowing with talent. Those early years in New York were far from glamorous. She waited tables, took acting classes, and auditioned endlessly. Rejection became her daily routine, but she carried it with humor. Friends remember her laughing at failed auditions, saying, "At least I made them remember me." She was fearless, but not in the usual sense. Her courage came from vulnerability, the willingness to be awkward, unpolished, imperfect. And that was exactly what made her magnetic. In 1968, her persistence paid off when she landed a small role in the Broadway musical Hair. It was the counterculture era, rebellion, youth and identity all colliding on stage. But Diane was different from the others. While some actors wanted to shock the audience, she wanted to move them. She refused to perform nude, which almost cost her the job, yet even in defiance she stayed authentic. She didn't need to follow the crowd to make people notice her. Her performance caught attention, not for spectacle but for sincerity. Casting directors began to see her name in a new light. Then came a moment that would change her life forever. A chance audition for a nervous, bespectacled playwright named Woody Allen. He was preparing a play called Play It Again, Sam. Diane walked into the audition, tall and eccentric, wearing mismatched clothes and radiating a kind of unguarded honesty that was impossible to fake. She didn't play the part. She became it. Allen later said that she had the perfect rhythm for comedy, a rhythm born of chaos and curiosity. That day, two artistic worlds collided. Diane Keaton had found her voice, and Woody Allen had found his muse. But before the fame and the films, there was still the girl, the daughter who loved words, who feared normality, who dreamed of something bigger than applause. She would carry that same restlessness into every stage of her life. Years later, when asked about her childhood, she said softly, "I was just a girl who didn't know what to do with all her feelings, so I learned to make stories out of them." It was that emotional honesty that turned her from a dreamer into an icon. Her beginnings weren't built on glamour or privilege. They were built on contradiction, the tension between shyness and courage, humor and melancholy, solitude and longing. All of it would soon find its expression in the strange, beautiful woman the world would come to know as Annie Hall. But before she became a symbol of independence and wit, she had to face the stage that would make and define her. New York in the early 70s was not kind to dreamers. It was chaotic, electric, and unforgiving, a city that demanded honesty in exchange for belonging. For Diane Keaton, it was everything she had been searching for. She had spent years struggling through bit parts, waiting for a role that would allow her to be fully herself. That chance came when she met Woody Allen. He was already an established playwright and stand-up comic, known for his sharp wit and awkward intelligence. She was still the new girl, tall, wide-eyed, dressed in thrift store layers, and carrying an unshakable curiosity about everything. Their connection was immediate. They spoke the same language, humor wrapped around insecurity. When Diane auditioned for Play It Again, Sam, she didn't just deliver lines, she played with them. Her timing was offbeat, her expressions unpredictable. It shouldn't have worked, but somehow it was magic. Allen once said that she had a way of making imperfection into style. The audience agreed. The play was a success, and for the first time Diane found herself standing under Broadway lights not as a hopeful, but as a revelation. Behind the curtain, something deeper began to form. Their professional chemistry evolved into quiet affection. He admired her spontaneity. She admired his intellect. But more than anything, they understood each other's loneliness. In an industry obsessed with control and image, they both thrived on vulnerability. It was the start of a relationship that blurred the lines between art and life. They laughed together, argued endlessly, and inspired one another in ways that would change modern cinema forever. When Woody began transitioning from stage to screen, it was Diane he trusted most. She appeared in several of his films, Sleeper, Love and Death, Manhattan. But it was Annie Hall in 1977 that immortalized their collaboration. The film was not just another romantic comedy. It was a revolution, a love story told through fragments, reflections, and conversations that felt more like real life than fiction. At its center was Diane, portraying the kind of woman the audience had never seen before. Awkward yet confident, naive yet wise, fragile yet magnetic. Her character's name, Annie Hall, wasn't just inspired by her, it was her. The mannerisms, the pauses, the offbeat humor, all pulled straight from her real personality. Even her wardrobe was hers. She walked onto set wearing men's ties, vests, and baggy khakis, and Allen told the costume designer to let her keep them. Without meaning to, Diane Keaton invented a fashion movement, The world fell in love with Annie Hall, but what they were really falling for was Diane. The Academy crowned her Best Actress. Critics called her the heartbeat of modern cinema. But behind the applause, Diane felt something more complicated. She was proud, yes, but also uncertain. How much of Annie Hall belonged to her? And how much to Woody Allen? She once said in an interview, "People think Annie Hall is me. Maybe it is. Maybe it's the version of me I wish I could have stayed." That sentence revealed everything. Fame was never her dream. Expression was. And suddenly, expression had become something the world wanted to consume. Her relationship with Woody evolved as fame changed them both. Their romance faded, but the friendship endured. Unusual, tender, and unbreakable. Even when they stopped being lovers, their creative bond deepened. They continued to work together, creating films that felt like conversations between two souls who understood each other too well to let go. For Allen, she was more than a collaborator. In later years, he would admit, "As time went on, I made movies for an audience of one, Diane Keaton." It wasn't flattery. It was confession. Her opinion mattered more to him than the world's applause, but Diane never saw herself as anyone's muse. She was an artist standing on her own ground. She once laughed in an interview, "Muse? I'm too messy for that. I think he just liked that I was strange." Yet the truth was that her strangeness was exactly what the world needed. In an age when women in Hollywood were still expected to be poised, glamorous, and controlled, Diane's clumsy laughter and authenticity felt revolutionary. She didn't perform perfection. She performed truth. That truth carried her beyond Woody Allen's world. She began working with other filmmakers, exploring deeper emotional landscapes. In Looking for Mr. Goodbar, she played a woman torn between independence and danger. In Reds, directed by Warren Beatty, she portrayed the political. Journalist Louise Bryant, a performance that earned her another Academy Award nomination. Each role pushed her further, from being Woody Allen's leading lady and closer to becoming her own artistic universe. But even as her career soared, she never lost the sense of doubt that had followed her since childhood. She once said, "I never really felt like I belonged anywhere, not even when I was winning." That mixture of success and insecurity became part of her mystique. She embodied the idea that you could be admired by millions and still feel misunderstood. Behind her smile, friends noticed how reflective she had become. Fame, she said, had given her everything except peace. The more people adored her, the more she retreated into herself. She began writing journals, capturing thoughts about love, mortality, and the strangeness of fame. When Annie Hall swept the Oscars, she attended the ceremony in her own unconventional way, dressed not in a gown but in a tuxedo. It was her quiet rebellion against conformity, her way of saying, "I can still be me." And when her name was called as Best Actress, she looked surprised, not because she doubted her work, but because she never imagined her eccentricity would be celebrated. She didn't thank everyone in the traditional order. Instead, she spoke softly, humbly, smiling through tears. "This means so much," she said, her voice trembling. "Thank you for letting me be myself." It was a simple sentence, but one that summed up her entire existence. By the time the night ended, Diane Keaton was no longer just an actress. She was a movement, a symbol of self-acceptance in a world that tried to label everything. Woody Allen once reflected, "She taught me that comedy can be honest and honesty can be funny." Al Pacino would later say something similar. There was no act with Diane. What you saw was what she was, and that's what made her beautiful. The woman who had once doubted whether she belonged now stood as the face of authenticity in an age obsessed with illusion. But as the lights of Annie Hall faded and her name became myth, Diane began to feel the weight of her own legend. The world had seen her as the dreamer, the lover, the muse. What they hadn't seen yet, what she herself hadn't yet faced, was the cost of becoming someone everyone else adored. By the late 1970s, Diane Keaton had become the kind of star who didn't need an introduction. Her name alone carried a certain warmth, a cinematic intimacy. Everyone felt as if they knew her. The eccentric woman who wore men's clothes, laughed too loudly, and turned awkwardness into charm. But fame, as she would later admit, is a fragile kind of love. It adores you only when you stay the same. In the years following Annie Hall, she found herself in a strange paradox. She was everywhere, yet more isolated than ever. The very world that celebrated her independence now demanded she fit an image. Directors wanted the Diane Keaton type. Magazine covers tried to decode her style. Hollywood wanted her quirks packaged and predictable. She resisted quietly. When the press asked about her fashion, she shrugged. "It's just what I wear," she said. When interviewers pried into her relationships, she joked her way out of the question. Humor was her armor, a way of hiding what she didn't want the world to touch. But behind the humor, she felt the slow erosion of privacy. Fame turned every smile into a headline. The public adored her, but the price of that adoration was constant exposure. Friends would later say she spent long nights alone, rereading letters, watching old movies, wondering if she'd traded too much of herself to be understood. Woody Allen had once captured her essence on screen, the vulnerability that peeked through her laughter. But off-screen, the vulnerability deepened. She wanted to be seen yet feared being known. That contradiction became the quiet rhythm of her life. When she looked around, the Hollywood of her youth had begun to vanish. The old guard of auteurs and rebels was giving way to blockbuster culture. Intimacy was being replaced by spectacle. Diane, ever the romantic, felt increasingly out of place. "I'm from another time," she said once, when stories mattered more than fame. Still, she continued working. She took roles that challenged her, roles that weren't safe or comfortable. Looking for Mr. Goodbar showed audiences a darker side of her, a woman chasing freedom and finding danger instead. Critics praised her bravery, but the film's heavy themes lingered in her mind longer than she expected. For the first time, she realized how art could wound as deeply as it could heal. Her next major turn came with Reds, 1981, directed by Warren Beatty. On set, she poured herself into the character of Louise Bryant, a woman torn between love and ideology, desire and duty. It wasn't just a role. It was a reflection of her own contradictions. When the film earned her another Oscar nomination, she accepted it with grace, but something had changed. The thrill of recognition no longer filled her the way it once had. Fame had made her visible, but visibility had made her vulnerable. In interviews, she started to speak more about impermanence, how success fades, how applause can't last. She often compared fame to a friend that never calls you back. At parties and award shows, she was still the magnetic presence everyone adored, smiling, witty, effortlessly original. But those closest to her noticed how quickly she'd retreat once the cameras were gone. She'd slip into solitude, preferring quiet over celebration. Fame had given her the world's attention, but stolen her anonymity. For Woody Allen, watching her navigate that paradox was painful. He once said, "Diane always seemed happiest when no one was watching." In his films, he continued to write characters inspired by her, strong, unpredictable women searching for meaning in a noisy world. And though they no longer shared a home or romance, they still shared an unspoken language of understanding. But there was another presence now in her life, Al Pacino. He was her opposite in every way, intense, private, and consumed by his craft. On the set of The Godfather, she had been drawn to him not just for his talent, but for his mystery. In a world obsessed with image, he remained unshakably real. Their connection had always been electric, and over the years, it would resurface like an unfinished melody. Yet at this stage of her life, Diane wasn't looking for someone to complete her. She was trying to figure out who she was beyond the applause. "Fame makes you forget what silence sounds like," she said in one interview. "And I miss silence." In her journals, she wrote about her fear of growing older in a business that worshipped youth. She watched younger actresses being celebrated for qualities she once embodied: spontaneity, freshness, vulnerability, and wondered when the world would stop calling her quirky and start calling her past. It's a quiet kind of fear, one that only artists know, the fear of becoming invisible while everyone still sees you. As the years passed, her work began to slow. She chose projects carefully, leaning into stories that mirrored her own aging with honesty and humor. But no matter how many roles she played, the public never stopped seeing her as Annie Hall. She once said with a smile, "I don't mind. Annie was the best of me, but she wasn't all of me." It was a confession that revealed how she saw herself, as a mosaic, not a memory. Each film, each heartbreak, each quiet night alone was just another piece of the puzzle. But fame has a way of distorting even the most grounded hearts. There were moments when she felt detached from her own life, watching herself through headlines and interviews, like an actress trapped in her own movie. She began to crave simplicity, days without cameras, mornings without makeup, conversations that didn't end up in print. For a while, she disappeared from the public eye. No scandals, no dramatic exit, just silence. Friends said she was writing more, reflecting more, finding solace in photography and architecture. She once remarked that she loved buildings because they don't have to pretend to be anything they're not. That sentence, in its quiet sadness, said everything about her state of mind. She was exhausted by pretending, by the endless demand to stay charming, relevant, and visible. She had spent decades performing authenticity for the world, but now she wanted to live it privately. Even Woody noticed her retreat. "She's always had this way of disappearing when things get loud," he said years later. "It's her form of survival, and survive she did, not through scandal or spectacle, but through the quiet strength of self-acceptance. While others chased fame's spotlight, Diane had the courage to step out of it, but life, as it often does, was preparing her for another kind of chapter, one that would test her heart more deeply than any performance ever could. Because just as she was beginning to make peace with solitude, love would find her again, not as fantasy, not as art, but as a man she had never truly let go of. They first met under the unforgiving lights of The Godfather, set in 1971. The film was chaos, endless nights, pressure, egos, and cigarette smoke curling in the air, yet in the middle of it, something quiet and human sparked between them. Diane Keaton was cast as Kay Adams, the bright, moral heartbeat opposite a young actor named Al Pacino, who carried an intensity that seemed older than his years. From the very first rehearsal, their energy was magnetic. She would tease him, laugh at his seriousness. He would stare at her, trying to understand how someone could be that spontaneous, that alive. The camera caught it instantly, that impossible mix of purity and danger. What audiences would later call chemistry was simply the truth leaking through the performance. When The Godfather premiered in 1972, it changed their lives. The film became legend overnight, and so did they. But while the world saw the rise of two cinematic titans, behind the scenes, a fragile love story had begun, one too honest for Hollywood to ever fully understand. Their relationship grew slowly, between films, between roles, between moments stolen from the noise. Diane would describe him as charming, hilarious, a non-stop talker, but also like a lost orphan, this beautiful, broken savant. She adored him. He, in his own way, adored her too. But where she longed for something lasting, he feared it. Al Pacino was consumed by his craft, by the chase of excellence that leaves no room for normal life. Diane, though equally devoted to her art, was beginning to crave the grounding she had always avoided: home, commitment, connection. "I was mad for him," she later confessed, "but I couldn't have him." Their romance became a rhythm, together, apart, together again, spanning nearly 2 decades of longing and distance. Every reunion felt like the continuation of a conversation neither of them could finish. Every separation felt inevitable. There was no dramatic betrayal, no cruel ending, only time, and the quiet knowledge that love is not always enough to make two lives align. She gave him an ultimatum once: marriage or goodbye. He chose freedom. She chose peace. Years later, when she looked back, she said it was the right choice, but not the easy one. Pacino never forgot. In interviews, he rarely spoke about her, but those who knew him said her name lingered in his silences. They stayed friends, occasionally reuniting at events, always with a gentle awkwardness, a warmth that time couldn't erase. When she received the American Film Institute's Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017, Al took the stage. His words were brief but trembling. "You're a great artist, Di. I love you forever." The audience applauded. Diane smiled, a mixture of surprise, affection, and history written across her face. For a moment, the years disappeared. Two people who had once held the world in their hands looked at each other not as legends, but as what they had always been. Almost. In truth, their love was never lost. It just existed in a different form, one beyond possession. They understood each other's ghosts. Both had built their lives around characters, scripts, and fleeting moments of truth. Yet together they had shared something that couldn't be written. Friends would later say that Diane carried Al's memory like a pressed flower, something beautiful she kept, but never reached for. She dated others, even loved others, but none touched her heart the same way. Perhaps because Al represented everything she both wanted and feared: devotion without surrender, passion without permanence. And for Pacino, Diane remained the measure of tenderness. He had other loves, other children, other films, but when her name came up, his eyes softened. One friend recalled him saying, "She made me laugh more than anyone ever has. I just didn't know how to keep her." When news of her passing reached him decades later, it wasn't just grief, it was reckoning. According to those close to him, he told a confidant, "I'll regret that forever. Not marrying her, not calling more, not saying enough." For a man who had spent a lifetime mastering words, he found himself speechless. For Diane, love had always been a lesson, not a possession. She had once told a reporter, "I never married because I didn't want to disappear into someone else's story." Yet with Al, she had come the closest to risking that. And when it ended, she didn't turn bitter. She turned inward, toward motherhood, toward meaning, toward the quiet life she had long postponed. Their love, imperfect as it was, gave both of them what art could not: the reminder that beneath the fame, beneath the legend, they were still human, still yearning, still breakable. Theirs was a romance that refused to die because it never fully lived. It existed in between, in glances, laughter, memory. It was love uncontained, unfulfilled, but unforgettable. And so when Al Pacino whispered, "I love you forever" to a woman the world was already mourning, it wasn't a performance. It was confession. For Diane Keaton, love was never about the fairy tale. It was about the truth of imperfection, the bravery of wanting more, even when more was impossible. In her films, she played women searching for connection in a chaotic world. In life, she lived that same search with grace. Her relationship with Al Pacino was proof that some stories don't need a happy ending to be eternal, because love, in its purest form, doesn't always demand forever. Sometimes it just asks to be remembered. When the applause began to fade, Diane Keaton didn't chase it. She didn't fill her calendar with desperate comebacks or surround herself with people who needed to remind her she was still famous. Instead, she went home, not to the glamour of Beverly Hills, but to something gentler, quieter, more human. In her 50s, she did something that startled the world and healed her spirit. She became a mother, not through marriage, not through Hollywood, but through choice. She adopted a baby girl named Dexter in 1996, and 5 years later, a boy named Duke. By then, she was already a legend. Yet she said that for the first time in her life, she finally felt like she was beginning. She had spent decades portraying women who struggled to balance love, identity, and independence. Now she was living that paradox in the most real way possible. Motherhood, she once admitted, didn't come naturally to her. "I didn't think I was prepared," she told Ladies' Home Journal in 2008. "Motherhood wasn't an urge I couldn't resist. It was a thought I'd been thinking for a very long time, and then I plunged in." It was classic Keaton, self-aware, hesitant, brave. She didn't pretend to be perfect, and that was what made her real. There were moments of exhaustion, self-doubt, and fear that she wouldn't measure up. But there was also joy, the kind of joy that fame could never give. Late-night feedings replaced red carpets. Children's laughter replaced interviews. And in that transition, something beautiful happened. She stopped performing. Her friends noticed it first. The guardedness, the ironic humor she had used for years to protect herself, it softened. She began to speak differently, move differently, even dress differently. The wide-brimmed hats remained, but now they shaded a face that smiled for reasons unrelated to applause. She told People magazine, "They have no interest in what I do," which I think is very healthy. We live a relatively normal, well, sort of normal life. That sort of said everything. She was still Diane Keaton. Eccentric, unpredictable, endlessly curious. But for the first time, she was anchored by something permanent. Her home became a reflection of her heart, filled with books, photographs, old movie reels, and the chaos of family life. She collected architecture the way some collect jewelry. She saw beauty in imperfection, old wood, peeling paint, worn edges, the same things she once saw in herself. She began writing more. Her memoir, Then Again, wasn't a celebrity story. It was an exploration of her relationship with her late mother, the woman who first taught her that creativity could coexist with tenderness. Through those pages, Diane found a deeper truth. Every artist spends their life trying to finish the story their parents began. As her children grew, she gave fewer interviews. Fame no longer defined her. When she appeared in public, she seemed more relaxed, more grounded. Her humor was still sharp, but it carried warmth instead of irony. "I don't think it would have been a good idea for me to marry," she once said. "I'm really glad I didn't. I think I needed something more maternal." And in that quiet admission lay decades of reconciliation with her choices, her solitude, and her past loves. Al Pacino was still a name she spoke with affection. Woody Allen, despite controversy and time, remained a friend she defended. But the truest love of her life, it seemed, was not any man. It was her children. When Dexter got married in 2021, Diane wore a cream pantsuit and her signature hat. She looked radiant, proud, and content. In photos, she wasn't the actress or the icon, just a mother smiling at her daughter's happiness. That same year, she posted a message online, simple but profound. "I love them. They are everything." For someone who had once built a life out of questioning love, those words were her peace treaty with it. Motherhood also brought her closer to the truth she had always explored on screen, that fulfillment is not found in applause, but in purpose. The same woman who once portrayed restless lovers and neurotic dreamers now spent her days cooking breakfast, worrying about homework, and reminding her son to clean his room. And she loved it. In one interview, she laughed, "Rule number 1 in parenting: secretly worry without letting the kids know you're worried." It was a sentence both funny and deeply revealing, a reminder that she still carried her old contradictions with grace. Her children never followed her into acting. They stayed out of the spotlight, something Diane deeply appreciated. She wanted them to have what she never did, a life untouched by public expectation. And yet, even as she embraced normalcy, the past was never too far behind. Every so often, she'd receive a call, an award, an invitation to speak at retrospectives. Each time she'd smile, thank the crowd, and quietly return to her home life. Fame had once been her stage. Now it was simply a guest she entertained politely before returning to the real world. There's a certain kind of wisdom that only comes when you stop running toward the noise. Diane found it in the ordinary: the morning coffee, the sound of her children laughing, the stillness after a long day. She began taking long walks alone, something she called her thinking time. When asked once what she thought about during those walks, she said, "Everything and nothing." That's the beauty of getting older. You realize you don't need all the answers. In a culture obsessed with reinvention, Diane Keaton did something far more radical. She stayed true. She didn't reinvent herself. She revealed herself. The woman who once defined independence on screen had finally found it off screen, not in rebellion but in peace. By her 60s, she was no longer chasing love or legacy. She was living them quietly every day, in the laughter of her children, the creak of her old house, and the joy of being exactly who she was meant to be. It was the calm after the storm, the years of stillness she had always earned but never taken. And yet, time with its soft cruelty was still moving. The roles slowed, the interviews grew shorter, and her reflections grew deeper. She had found meaning, but soon the world would remind her that even peace must one day make room for farewell. It began quietly. No public announcement, no news story, no whispered leak through the tabloids. Diane Keaton simply started appearing less. The woman who had once filled screens with laughter and light now spent more time behind closed doors, surrounded by the people who made her feel safe, her children, her closest friends, and the memories that had shaped her. She had always been private about pain. The same instinct that once protected her heart in Hollywood now protected her dignity. When she began to struggle with her health, she faced it with the same humor she had used all her life to disarm the world. "I'm fine," she would say with that mischievous grin, "just slower. I've earned slower." Behind that deflection was the truth: her body was growing tired. Friends noticed the change: fewer outings, shorter conversations, longer silences. Yet even in decline, she refused to let illness define her. When people asked what she was doing these days, she'd smile and say, I'm just living. She still kept her home full of life, flowers on every table, sunlight streaming through her windows, walls covered in black and white photographs from decades of art and love. She would sit for hours looking at them, not in sorrow but in gratitude. I've been lucky, she told one friend. I got to be exactly who I wanted to be. Dexter and Duke became her anchors. They kept her company through quiet afternoons, cooked dinner with her, reminded her of birthdays she'd forgotten. They were her proudest creation, not her films, not her fame, but the two lives she had nurtured into independence. Woody Allen called her from time to time. Their conversations were short, sometimes just a few words of reassurance. He knew better than anyone that Diane didn't need pity. She needed presence. Once, during one of those calls, he reportedly said, "You were my favorite scene in every movie I made." She laughed softly. "That's because I never stopped improvising." It was the last time they spoke. Al Pacino, too, reached out in his own way. Though they had lived separate lives for decades, he still carried her memory like an unfinished chapter. According to a friend, he sent her a letter, simple, handwritten, full of gratitude and regret. "How you made me better," he wrote, on screen and off. Whether she ever replied, no one knows. But those who saw her near the end say she kept that letter on her nightstand. As the days grew slower, she found comfort in the small rituals she loved. Morning coffee on the porch, a notebook filled with quotes, old songs playing softly in the background. She reread her favorite books, revisited her old journals, sometimes laughing at her younger self, sometimes crying for her innocence. She never stopped being curious. Even as her strength waned, she remained fascinated by the world, its contradictions, its beauty, its flaws. "Life's absurd," she once said, smiling faintly. "That's why I love it." In her final weeks, she was surrounded by love. Friends described her home as peaceful. No hospital machines, no press intrusions, just warmth and stillness. Dexter and Duke stayed close. They protected her privacy fiercely, just as she had protected theirs. She slipped away one October morning in Los Angeles. The light came in soft that day, the air clear and calm. She was 79. The news broke slowly, like the dimming of a theater's lights. For a few hours, no one believed it. The idea that Diane Keaton, the woman who had made the world laugh through heartbreak, could be gone felt impossible. Hollywood responded the only way it knew how, with silence. And then with words. Woody Allen was one of the first to speak. In his tribute, he called her unlike anyone the planet has experienced or is unlikely to ever see again. He wrote of her laugh, her light, her freedom. As time went on, I made movies for an audience of one. Diane Keaton. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was devotion, the kind that outlasts careers and criticism, the kind that grief cannot silence. Francis Ford Coppola, the man who had first cast her in The Godfather, wrote his own farewell. Words can't express the wonder and talent of Diane Keaton. Endlessly intelligent, so beautiful. Everything about her was creativity personified. But perhaps the most moving response came from Al Pacino. He didn't issue a statement or a tweet. Instead, a close friend revealed that he simply sat in his home that night, re-watching The Godfather, pausing every scene that held her face. He couldn't finish it, the friend said. He just kept staring at her, whispering something no one could hear. For Woody and Al, her death was more than loss. It was the closing of a story that had defined them both. One had found his voice through her, the other had found his heart. And now both were left with silence. The public tributes poured in. Fans lit candles outside the TCL Chinese Theater, where her handprint still rested in stone. Others played clips of her laugh, her smile, her iconic lines. The streets of Hollywood were brighter that night, as if trying to outshine the grief. For her children, the world's mourning was both comfort and burden. They had always shared their mother with millions. Now they were sharing her memory. In one of her last interviews, she had said something that now reads like a farewell. "We all think there's more time, more love, more chances, more stories to tell. But the truth is it's already enough. What you've lived, what you've loved, that's the masterpiece." It was a line worthy of her scripts, as wise, understated, and heartbreakingly final. When the credits of her life began to roll, the world didn't just remember an actress. They remembered a woman who made imperfection sacred, who taught audiences that humor could be holy, who showed that love, even when it doesn't last, can still be eternal. In her passing, she left behind not emptiness, but echoes. Echoes of laughter, echoes of honesty, echoes of a woman who never stopped being real. When Diane Keaton's death became public, the world began to mourn her through headlines. But for two men, the grief was not something to perform. It was private, intimate, and wordless. Woody Allen and Al Pacino, the two greatest mirrors of her life, found themselves standing in the same shadow, trying to articulate a loss that words could never contain. Woody wrote first. His essay appeared in the free press, but it read more like a letter. It wasn't written for the audience or the critics. It was written for her. Her face and laugh illuminated any space she entered, he wrote. As time went on, I made movies for an audience of one, Diane Keaton. I never read a single review of my work and cared only what she had to say about it. For the man who built his legacy on dialogue, the silence after her death was deafening. Their connection had outlasted romance, marriage proposals, even decades of scandal. Through all of it, she had remained his compass, the person whose opinion defined his art, whose laughter could turn insecurity into inspiration. In his tribute, he remembered their first meeting in 1969. If Huckleberry Finn were a gorgeous young woman, he wrote, she'd be Keaton. He described her as unlike anyone the planet has experienced or is unlikely to ever see again. Those words didn't sound rehearsed. They sounded raw. They came from a man acknowledging that a part of his life, the brightest, most unguarded part, had ended. After the essay went viral, people called it one of the most beautiful tributes ever written by a filmmaker. But to those who knew Woody Allen, it was more than that. It was confession. He had spent decades making films about love, memory, and regret, and in every one of them there was a trace of her. She wasn't just a muse. She was the map. He ended his piece with a single line that seemed to tremble on the page. Still there are her movies, and her great laugh still echoes in my head. That echo, in truth, was all he had left. Al Pacino's reaction was quieter. He didn't write an essay or appear on talk shows. He didn't issue a formal statement or allow the cameras to catch his tears. But everyone around him knew he was grieving. According to a friend, Al had been in his Beverly Hills home when he heard the news. He sat down, put on The Godfather, and watched the scene where Kay pleads with Michael to let her go. Halfway through, he reportedly stopped the movie and whispered, "She's really gone." Then he wept. For a man who had spent his life behind stoicism and performance, that breakdown said more than any headline could. He had loved her in silence for decades, carrying her memory like an unfinished prayer. In interviews long before her death, he had spoken of her with reverence. "She was the love of my life," he once said. "I just didn't know it in time." After her passing, those words resurfaced everywhere. Fans reposted them, journalists quoted them, and his regret became part of the story. But Al didn't need to clarify. He had already said everything that mattered. Friends later revealed that he had written a short note to be read privately at her memorial. It said, "You were the light that never asked to be noticed. I should have noticed sooner." It was the purest kind of remorse, not self-pity but realization. The kind that arrives too late for conversation, yet right on time for truth. Woody and Al had always represented two halves of Diane's world, the intellectual and the emotional, the artist and the romantic. She had loved both of them deeply and differently, and in their grief they revealed how she had changed them. Woody learned tenderness from her. Al learned vulnerability. In an industry where people often perform affection for publicity, their responses felt startlingly real. There was no promotion, no self-reference, no vanity. Just loss. For Woody, it was losing the voice that had guided him through doubt. For Al, it was losing the face that had haunted his dreams. For both, it was a reckoning, the final acknowledgement that she had been more than a chapter in their lives. She had been the story itself. The world saw the public tributes. What it didn't see were the quiet gestures. Woody sent flowers, a simple arrangement, white lilies and pale roses. Al attended the small private ceremony in Los Angeles, sitting in the back, wearing dark glasses, hands clasped. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. Afterward, he walked to her handprints outside the TCL Chinese Theater. He stood there for several minutes, touching the stone. Someone nearby said he murmured her name. Then he walked away without looking back. The people who loved Diane always said she never liked grand gestures. She believed love was proven in the small, consistent things, the care, the patience, the loyalty that doesn't need an audience. And perhaps that's why, in the end, the men who loved her didn't perform their grief. They lived it quietly, the way she would have wanted. As weeks passed, tributes poured in from actors she had inspired, filmmakers she had guided, fans she had unknowingly comforted. Every message seemed to carry the same undertone. She made people feel seen. Her gift was not just her talent, it was her empathy. For Woody Allen and Al Pacino, that empathy had changed their lives. Each man, in his own way, had built part of his identity through her. Without Diane, they were forced to confront the loneliness she had always filled. They had loved her, differently, imperfectly, perhaps even selfishly, but genuinely. And though their love stories with her had ended long ago, their grief proved what Diane had always believed, that love never really leaves. It just changes shape. She had once said in an interview, "Love isn't about holding on, it's about remembering kindly." Now that was all that remained, remembrance. In the final months after her passing, both men retreated into their work again, as if creating might keep her spirit close. Woody began writing smaller, quieter stories. Al, when asked about his old films, said softly, "They're like ghosts now." Especially hers. Theirs was not a rivalry or a triangle, it was something purer. Two men united by the same loss, grieving the same woman in different languages of silence. And perhaps that's what makes Diane Keaton's story eternal. She wasn't a conquest or a legend to them. She was the moment they each became human. Diane Keaton's death was not the end of her story. It was the beginning of her afterglow, the quiet illumination that lingers when someone's spirit refuses to fade. Weeks passed, then months, and yet her presence remained, and in laughter, in art. In the lines of dialogue she once spoke so effortlessly that they became immortal. For her children, life became a balancing act between grief and gratitude. Dexter and Duke often said that the world remembered their mother as a star, but they remembered her as warmth, the person who danced barefoot in the kitchen, who laughed at bad jokes, who stayed up late just to talk about nothing at all. "She made the ordinary feel extraordinary," Dexter said once. That was her gift. Hollywood, too, continued to honor her. Film festivals dedicated nights to her legacy. Old co-stars shared memories that sounded like love letters. Meryl Streep called her the bravest woman in the room, always. Diane's influence wasn't measured in awards anymore. It was measured in the lives she had quietly touched. In time, her films found a new generation. Young women discovering Annie Hall for the first time saw in her something timeless, a woman who made being flawed feel beautiful. They mimicked her fashion, her humor, her refusal to apologize for being herself. On social media, her laugh became a symbol, a rebellion against the perfection culture she'd never believed in. And everywhere, there was one sentence that seemed to follow her name: she never stopped being real. Woody Allen's essay, "Once a Moment of Mourning," became a permanent fixture of her memory. Readers described it as the most tender thing he ever wrote. In it, he had distilled decades of history into a few paragraphs that captured what no camera ever could, the purity of her soul. "Her great laugh still echoes in my head," he'd written. That line became the heartbeat of every tribute, the sound that outlived the silence. Al Pacino's farewell remained unspoken, but his grief reshaped him in ways words couldn't. Friends noticed he smiled less but spoke of her more. He would bring up her name when discussing love, artistry, or truth. To him, Diane represented what Hollywood had forgotten, that genius and goodness could coexist. "She never pretended," he told one interviewer softly. "She just was." Through them, two men bound by memory, Diane's story continued to breathe. Not as gossip or nostalgia, but as testament. The woman they both loved had become something greater than either of them alone could hold. She had become meaning itself. Her life was not perfect. It was brave. She stumbled, doubted, and refused to fit the mold. She turned insecurity into art and solitude into strength. She showed generations of women that independence wasn't loneliness, it was clarity. That beauty wasn't polish, it was truth. And even as she aged, she never surrendered to fear. "The trick," she once said, "is to find joy in the absurd." That single philosophy, equal parts humor and faith, became her legacy. In the years following her death, Retrospectives began appearing in film schools, museums, and streaming platforms. Critics called her the last of Hollywood's honest dreamers. Students studied her performances not just for technique, but for what she revealed about humanity. That vulnerability, the trembling between laughter and tears, became her signature long after she was gone. Some artists are remembered for what they created. Diane Keaton was remembered for what she allowed us to feel. Her death had united Woody Allen and Al Pacino in grief. Her life had united generations in empathy. Few people ever live so completely that even their absence feels alive. Diane did. She once said in an interview not long before her passing, "We don't leave behind fame or money. We leave behind energy, the way we made people feel." And perhaps that's why she endures. Her energy never left. It hums in the hearts of those who saw themselves in her laughter, who found courage in her imperfection, who realized through her that being different is its own kind of grace. There's a story her daughter once told. In Diane's home, there was a quote taped to the refrigerator. It was written in her handwriting, crooked and bold, "Keep it real, keep it kind, keep laughing." That was the gospel according to Diane Keaton, her holy trinity of being. When anniversaries of her death come around, social media floods with her images. But more than faces, people share feelings. They write how her movies made them less afraid to be themselves, how her roles made loneliness look poetic, how her voice made heartbreak sound survivable. That is legacy, not marble statues or grand memorials, but the quiet survival of someone's light in the lives of strangers. For Woody Allen, that light is memory. For Al Pacino, it is regret turned reverence. For her children, it is love that never dims. For the rest of the world, it is proof that art and authenticity, when fused, can make a human being immortal. Diane Keaton's story was never about perfection. It was about courage. The courage to be misunderstood, to stay soft in a hard world, to keep laughing when life demanded silence. And so, in the final reel of her life, the credits don't roll in darkness. They roll in light, the kind that doesn't fade, the kind that lingers, in memory, in laughter, in every soul that dares to be a little more honest because she once was. The light she left behind was not meant to be mourned. It was meant to be lived,